things are still really difficult in this country. They were really, really difficult towards the end of the Conservative government. They're still really difficult now. And it's not like the Labour government comes in with this big majority, and we've heard a lot about these metaphorical levers. You just pull a big lever and suddenly everything is fixed. Of course it isn't. This country suffered huge, deep, structural, social, cultural, economic, political problems that go back not just a couple of years, really going back to even pre the global financial crisis. So they're very, very deep problems. And this government has not been perfect, and I'll come on to that. But in the interests of being objective and balanced and fair, which is obviously what I try and do. I mean, of course, I'm Labour adjacent, I take the Labour whip, but I'm also an Ofcom regulated broadcaster, and I like to hope that I am objective and fair in my analysis of politics. I think, to be fair, in terms of the inheritance that Labour came in with, it was really, really, really tough. I've heard this argument used, and I think there is some merit in it. When Tony Blair came into power, public services were in a terrible mess, but there was a growing economy. When David Cameron came into power, arguably the kind of last sort of stable, serious Conservative Prime Minister, their public services were in much better shape, but the economy was in a very difficult place because we just had the global financial crash. I think, to be fair to Keir Starmer and his team, when he has come in, he has got a really difficult set of public services because of all of these years of austerity. And we have an economy which is in a real mess because of COVID, because of high inflation, and all of these other structural problems. Plus, I think, to be fair to him, and I have been, I've done many different jobs in my time. I started off as a civil servant back in 1997. I then became a special advisor in government and then advising the Labour Party in opposition. I'm now a journalist, but I'm also a member of the House of Lords. So I've had like a kind of 360 degree view of lots of things. But the other thing which I think is fair to put in terms of what Keir Starmer's had to deal with, this country is really burnt out. It's burnt out, I think, socially. It's burnt out psychologically. This country has been through so much since the global financial crisis. And I think there is a weariness and an exhaustion and a real feeling that the state just doesn't work for them. It's like one more heave. They get a new government in, they get a change of leader, and they're told this time things are going to change, and they're not changing. I'm sure Kelly will give us lots more. So I think that's another backdrop. And I also think that the media climate is really difficult at the moment. Sometimes it used to be the case where strategists would say, do you know what? People only spend, I don't know, like 3 minutes a month thinking about politics. I just don't think that's the case anymore. I think the media landscape has changed so much and it's atomised. We know that social media is having a huge effect in terms of shaping how people feel. We have a much more, I think, emotional engagement with politics now, which is generally things are really tough. So that's my kind of general sort of why are things so tough. Has the government, what has this new government done? Well, I think, to be fair, you can't just turn around more than 14 years in 18 months. Even if you could clone Louise Casey, I still think that would just be really, really difficult to do for all the reasons that she set out. But you also have to concede, and I do say this as a Labour person, some mistakes have been made. I think it's fair to say that because there was this early snap election, the new government came in with not as clear a vision in terms of what they wanted to prosecute straight away and the things that they really, really wanted to focus on. Personally, I think it was a big mistake to go in straight away with something like the winter fuel allowance, because psychologically, you have got a country which has been begging for change and thirsting for change, and the big message is change, and it's a very counterintuitive message for a new Labour government to come in with. I think so many of the points that Louise spoke to were really important in terms of quite a demoralised civil service, a civil service which has got, I think, learned helplessness, but also a new set of ministers who were inexperienced, who didn't have that kind of vision and, right, these are like the big, big things that we want to achieve very quickly. I'm going to be taking accountability and responsibility for this because it's my kind of name above the door, but I'm going to press you as well. I mean, when I look back in terms of the work I did in government when I was a government spad, we worked on a lot, we got a lot of things done. It wasn't always easy, but we were able to get there. I mean, I worked a lot on the Equality Act, which was only meant to be a consolidation, tidying up exercise, but actually turned into a really big game-changing piece of legislation that was so cross-cutting across government. And at the beginning, people were like, you're not going to be able to do this in the time that you have. And we did. And actually, I can see Helen Redden-Bond, who was a great member of our team as a civil servant. And I think, to Louise's point, and Wes made this point earlier, I feel that there was a much better sense of team, and I think that's just been hollowed out over the years for a lot of the reasons that Louise says. I don't think there's a very good sense of team between ministers and civil servants anymore. I think for whatever, and I think Louise, I won't repeat what Louise said, I think that is a big factor, but governments want to be in power. Nobody has forced Keir Starmer and his team to do this. This is something which is very, very hard fought for. And it's very easy to just constantly blame the civil service, to blame the state, to say that nothing can be done, to say that everything is too difficult. But I think the government is actually getting quite a lot of things done at the moment. There are signs that things are happening. But the other thing, and I say this as a journalist and a communicator, you also, in this particular era, which is so hypermedia focused and social media focused, you have to tell the story of what you're doing as well. You have to communicate with the public, and so you can't do good by stealth. There's no point in doing that. There is a war for attention at the moment. The way we consume media and consume our knowledge is completely changing. And my big anxiety as we head into very difficult elections this year, and of course they're pitch rolling towards the next general election, which will be here, in the blink of an eye. This government is doing some good things. Not everything is perfect, but there's some really important things are going on. Like, just look at infrastructure, building new power stations, all of these kind of things. But if it doesn't tell its citizens what it's doing, then there's almost sort of no point. There's no point doing things in the darkness. So that's my kind of opening gambit.
Great. Kelly, I'd be really interested. I mean, Ayesha just painted a picture of voters perceiving worse and worse outcomes through time, but also of the core, the answers to this problem, the government losing capabilities and coherence and working together. You've done a lot of polling on this. Tell us, what are the public thinking about this?
Well, it's a good question. It's obviously not the only question. The public are one important, very important stakeholder in this whole piece. As you say, Ipsos, we do lots of public perception polling, and we did this piece specifically for the IFG as part of the launch for this conference, and looked at what the public would give the government as a performance rating for the year that was 2025. I thought we might have some audience participation. Any ideas? Anybody think 0 to 3 in an overall rating out of 10? No. 3 to 6? More? 6 to 10? 7 to 10, she says.
Is 6 to 10 good?
I would say 6 to 10 is good to very good. No, so you're more in the middle than you are in the bottom end of that scale. So a quarter of the British public say 0. The average is actually 3.6%, which gives you a sense of where the British public are at on the performance of delivery over the year that has just passed. But it was a difficult year for all of the reasons that Ayesha mentioned. The context in which the government have taken the reins is obviously to the public as well quite a difficult and challenging time. It's 5 in 10 for Labour voters, just so you're aware as well, so it's slightly better. But the public are disappointed with the performance from the first main full year in government. And I just wanted to cover another 2 points from the polling, and then perhaps that will set the scene a little bit. It's not just the year that's passed. We're really interested in understanding how optimistic the public are and confident that the delivery on their priorities will be delivered against in the year ahead. And when you look at what their priorities are, I probably don't need to tell you, there's lots of research in the public domain, but cost of living, healthcare, of course, immigration is up there, and the economy. Those are the top 4 issues. And when we ask the public, do they think that the government will be likely to deliver against those, there's only 1/5 of them who say they are confident. So there's this real loss of hope that public services and public servants are going to deliver for them. And we've been doing this study, one of these studies across 30 countries now for a number of years, which is our global trends work. And we ask across those 30 countries, do you believe public services in your country will deliver for you in the future? And we used to be amongst many of the European nations, but we now sit up the top of that table as one of the, in amongst a lot of the LATAM nations, as a country where they are less confident that their government and their country services will be able to deliver for them in the year ahead. It's not a great place to be. There are lots of lovely things about LATAM. My daughter visited and tell me great tales, but it's not where you want to be in terms of public service performance. But what was most telling, I think, from the research we did with IFG was looking at the public's views on short versus long-term priorities. And this is often the most challenging thing for governments to balance, acting on those long-term priorities where we see the public aren't saying, these are the things you must fix immediately, like transport infrastructure, how well we use tech and AI. They're not pushing and pushing for that in the same way they are for solving some of the challenges like immigration, cost of living. But they still, and you can see this in the data, they still expect government to be thinking further ahead than they are and to start making real gains in some of those areas as well. So you can see that long and short-term priority piece in the mix from the polling. So it sort of sets the scene a little bit for what is a very timely conference on delivery and the challenges that are ahead. And what I would just finish with is that, you know, as leaders, and the government are effectively leading the country, leaders are in many ways dealers in hope. And we see a real loss of the future, not just in our country, but a number of Western markets as well. But in the UK, we have almost 2/3 of our people, the highest that we've seen since 1994, believing that the times that have been are better than the times that are ahead. And 6 in 10 are living for today because the future is so uncertain. And when that's the mindset of the general population, getting them behind acting for change becomes more challenging. So I will leave it there. Ed?
Well,
great.
So, Ed, I mean, when I've been involved in politics roughly since 2010, and it seems that ever since that time, the two sounds you can hear most often from Whitehall are complaints from the centre, often in the Sunday press, about how nobody does what they want. And then all the complaints from the civil service contacts we make around here that the centre doesn't seem to know what it wants and and it is not effective itself. I mean, you've been watching this and involved in it for over 30 years. Is this the right lens to be looking at this problem, that the centre has become less effective and hence we have all these problems?
Well, look, I think it's the challenge for this session, and it's the challenge which the IFG's commissioned into the organisation of the centre set out to look at, and therefore that's what I'm going to talk about. I mean, I think Kelly is right to say that these are unusually pessimistic times, and we see that in the work I do sometimes with Ayesha on Good Morning Britain. We have a very pessimistic, sceptical, worried audience, 3 million people every day. And I think Ayesha's right to say that these are unusual times. I mean, you said in the introduction that I was the city minister, and I got out of being the financial services minister in July 2007. When I left that job, it was all going fine. But we then faced a once-in-a-generation event, a global financial crisis in economic times as big as a war. And then we've had a global pandemic, a once-in-a-generation event. And we have war on the continent of Europe, a once-in-a-generation event. And Britain leaving the European Union, which in British terms, a once-in-a-generation event. 4 once-in-a-generation events in short succession is hard. And the underlying consequence of that has been a squeeze on living standards, which has lasted a long time, which drives pessimism, and a scepticism about whether governments and elites can deliver, which is then exploited politically, and that is a natural thing. So I think both of what you said are correct, and you can't blame the civil service or the organisation of Downing Street for those events. I think I'm also sceptical of men and women of a certain age coming along and saying that in our generation the politicians were better or the civil servants were better, and I'm not really going to go along with that line of arguing. But I do think to understand what is happening, you have to try and separate capacity and capability from, in 1973, The government had made some mistakes, and it wasn't clear that the Heath government was functioning that well, but they were facing a massive breakdown of the global economic order and a huge spike in oil prices. And in 1992, John Major's government made mistakes, I think, in the handling of the ERM crisis, but it was an inherited policy which was probably going to destroy whoever was in government. And in 2010, in 2020, I don't think the Boris Johnson government was a great government in terms of leadership capability, but every government would have struggled with that pandemic. And in 1978, I think Dennis Healey doesn't get the credit he deserves for handling the economic crisis, but they had no majority. And politics was biting so hard, and it was really difficult. You can't blame any of those things simply on the capacity of the centre. And if you look at things today and you say, yes, Keir Starmer's got a large majority, but it's a pessimistic time, and productivity growth in Britain and across Europe has been low for some time, and the media environment is hostile. And those are all things which are not about the centre. However, standing back from that, I think there are things to say about our capacity and capability. And these are things that I draw upon from my time in government, but then seeing governments before and subsequently. And in a way, to some extent, I'm going to agree with the IFG Commission, although not entirely. So first of all, I think that, and Ayesha talked about storytelling, I think it's very dangerous when government becomes gripped with a short-term mentality and a focus group-driven mentality and thinks about writing its manifesto simply to win elections. And you always have to be thinking about how will this develop, and will we be able to handle events if they turn out in the way we expect and which we don't expect, but also will we take people with us? And I think that, that good government is not only about having a view of where you're trying to take the country, and it's not only about explaining the values which underpin that vision, but it's also about diagnosis. It's about explaining to people what is it about where we are today which is so difficult. And how do we explain why our economy hasn't grown or productivity has not been so good? And how can we root our solutions in diagnosis? And if you think about focus group politics and you think about tomorrow's headlines, then you probably have a different philosophy and a different approach. But I've always believed, and this is certainly what we believed when I was at the Treasury, that in the end, the mediators are massively important. And if you can't win the argument with the mediators, and the mediators are the media and the commentators, but also the civil service, if they don't see what you're trying to achieve and understand your diagnosis and see why the levers you're pulling makes sense and what you're trying to do, it's very hard to take people with you, and it's also hard to then course correct and deal with shocks along the way. And I don't think that we are good enough as a country from the Prime Minister's office at using big moments to set out underlying vision and where we're trying to go to. But I also think when you have big moments, and budgets and spending reviews are big moments, you've really got to make sure that the whole government is taking maximal advantage of that. And I think that has not been as good as it could have been in the last 18 months with the new government. The reality is, though, you learn and you get better. When we came in 1997, we had said in our manifesto that we were going to have output targets for public services. And they were called the PSAs, the Public Service Agreements. The first ones we announced in 1998, we actually drew up within the Treasury, without any consultation with anybody, including, by the way, No.10. They were done all after the spending review. There was huge numbers of them. Gordon Brown was furious with us because we published them, and then he had to then go to the Select Committee and explain on what basis had we chosen these objectives and what was their rationale. By the time we got to 2002 and 2004 and 2006, I think we'd become much better at saying the conversation between No.10, the Treasury and departments for the spending review was both about a conversation about goal and also about means. And I'm not sure how retail that was, but I think it was hugely motivating for policy innovation, but also for taking the civil service with you on that journey and for explaining to the wider world what we were trying to do, all the independent reviews we did, think of like the year and a half of the Wondrous Review on the Health Service, but we did myriad of them. They were about building an argument, you know, not, as I said, a focus group retail argument, but what is your purpose? And I think, so my first point is I think that the centre has to be the leaders of underlying purpose, but also what is your big argument and what is your diagnosis? I think the trap Keir Starmer has fallen into and Rachel Reeves has fallen into in the last 18 months is they fought the election on the basis that they weren't the Conservatives. And, you know, for some months, you can carry on saying we're not the Conservatives. And, you know, this week, I've done 3 different interviews with government ministers who've all said we're not the Conservatives. But after 18 months, it isn't enough.
Yeah.
And so I think my first point is that underlying intellectual diagnosis, I think, is far more important. And, you know, and you know, you have to persuade the mediators, including the civil service. The second thing is institutional, about delivery. And it may not surprise you, I'm going to say this, I think it's fundamentally about the No.10 Treasury relationship. My personal view is it's second order, whether it's called the Cabinet Office or the Prime Minister's Department. And I'm quite happy to split the Cabinet Secretary and the Civil Service head of, but I think that's second or third order. And of course, in the end, what really matters is whether you've got leaders with judgment who choose the right people to be around them politically. But I do think the way the centre sets itself up and organises itself is very important. And I think that is fundamentally about the No.10 Treasury relationship. And I'll give you 2 examples. The first of all, on public service delivery, although we were a bit antsy about it in the months before, the innovation of the delivery unit in 2001 was so important that Michael Barber team in the Cabinet Office systematically worrying about delivery the whole time, in partnership with the Treasury, always in partnership, and these stock take meetings, which happened weekly, but if you're a Cabinet Minister, every couple of months, every meeting you went to, you sat in front of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. I mean, it wasn't the First Secretary. By the way, I'm quite happy to have a Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister. I don't really mind whether they're in the Cabinet Office or in the Prime Minister's office, because in the end, all that really matters is whether they talk to the Prime Minister and they get listened to. I think, you know, whether it's Pat McFadden or, what's his name?
Darren Jones.
Darren Jones. I think that is second order, but do you sit down, and I did this for 3 years as a Secretary of State, in front of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor together with advice to all of you from the delivery unit and the Treasury, which says, are we doing what we said we'd do publicly? And are we on track? And if we're not on track, do we understand why we're not on track? And does that tell us our goal's not right? Or is there something about the way we're delivering this? And in this room, do we know now what we will do to try and sort out this problem? There is no point in having a spending review in which the Treasury has conversations with ministers about budgets if you're not seeing that in the strategic context of delivery. And there's no point in the Prime Minister having regular meetings with Cabinet Ministers where he rails against the fact that things aren't working and why isn't it happening and is it the civil service fault and why can't somebody get this sorted out, unless you're doing that in the context of a genuinely strategic view of what is really going on with the Treasury and No.10 in partnership. And my sense is that the government is doing that well on Europe. And my sense is the government is doing that well on foreign affairs, and there have been kind of structural innovations in that space. And I still feel that the Cameron-Osborne decision to abolish PSAs in the delivery unit in 2010 was a terrible mistake, and we haven't really put in place a solution to that, and that's what needs to be done. But you've got to have the Chancellor and the Prime Minister at the meetings working in tandem, and you've got to have a culture which says, do we understand what's to do and do it? And if it's issues around the legal framework or, you know, the new equalities duty, well, have out that conversation. But don't just rail and say, these civil servants, they're not good enough. Or these vested interests, they're getting in our way. Or when we pull levers, it's not working. It was ever thus. In every generation, there's vested interests and there's challenges, and good politics is about solving problems and finding your path through. And if you're good at it, you do that. And I don't think that's got harder, it's different, but it's not harder, but the centre has to be strategic. One of the failures of our time in government, I think, because you wrote in the brief for me, was around regional growth and devolution and the delivery of and the work I did. We talked to John Major and Tony Blair and George Osborne, David Cameron, and all of them says, we wish we'd gone on and done it earlier. And if only we'd set out why we needed to do it, and if only we had won the argument for giving up some power. But actually, in every generation, they also say, well, the problem was either No. 10 thought it was a good idea, but the Treasury was sceptical, or the Treasury thought it was a good idea, and No. 10 wasn't bothered. Why didn't George Osborne manage to devolve skills between 2011 and 2014? Because David Cameron wasn't that interested. But that's a problem.
Yeah.
Why didn't Gordon Brown manage it? And so I think the partnership, the thing I would like, as well as the delivery unit on public services, is to see a similar thing around growth, in which the Prime Minister and the Chancellor together were sitting down with the key players, which would involve people from outside Whitehall, and saying, what are the barriers? What's our diagnosis? What are we going to do? It was really good that Keir Starmer had all the mayors into Downing Street in his first week in government. But the fact there was nobody there from the Treasury made my heart sink, because actually that partnership is so important. And then my third point is, independent of whether you set out your diagnosis and your goals, and whether you get the right delivery apparatus, it also comes down to that fundamental relationship between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And this is something which I've thought about a lot, and I have a revisionist view. And it's a revisionist view, although get my defences in first. There were times when the Blair-Bland relationship didn't work. There were times when it became dysfunctional.
There's your headline, everybody.
Although the thing which upset most of the people who subsequently wrote books is, in the key meeting, either Gordon Brown would turn to Tony Blair and say, I think we agree. Or Tony Blair would turn to Gordon Brown and say, do you think foundation hospitals should be able to borrow off budget? And Gordon would say no. And Tony would say, well, neither do I. The truth was, they always used to frustrate people so much by agreeing. However, this is my point. What you don't want, it's different if you have a minority government where there's no majority and where you need like a quad arrangement to hold things together. I think absent that, the idea of an executive group of ministers, I just don't think that's a structural solution. I think in the end it comes back to the Prime Minister-Chancellor relationship, and every Prime Minister will choose how they manage their cabinet in different ways. But that relationship, the Prime Minister-Chancellor, is so important. You do not want to be Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson. You don't want to get to the point where you disagree about what you're trying to do and your diagnosis of why you should do it, such that your advisors end up locked in conflict, and it ends up with the Chancellor leaving and the Prime Minister destroyed. That is not what you want. Nor, on the other side of the spectrum, do you want to be in a position where either the Prime Minister and the Chancellor agree, because, well, of course they should agree, but isn't agreeing good? Or where the Prime Minister thinks, I'll just leave that to the Treasury. I mean, David Cameron must regret so much he let the Treasury impose 20% budget cuts on the police in 2010 and announced the abolition of the Forestry Commission, because they had to do U-turns, and both of them took their eye off the ball on health reform. But George Osborne also sat in rooms in 2012, 2013, 2014 saying to David Cameron, I don't think a referendum on the European Union on this rapid timetable is a good idea. And so did Michael Gove. But when you ask them, but why didn't you pursue that? They say, well, because in the end, he was the Prime Minister. And when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer said, we want to be more like David Cameron and George Osborne than Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, I thought, I'm not sure that's right. Because in the end, what the Blair-Brown relationship, when it was functioning, which was actually most of the time, in policy terms, they were really good at challenging each other in a very informed way to not make mistakes and do the right thing. And although there were particular moments, by the way, even when Tony Blair challenged Gordon Brown on the euro, he didn't really want to join, and it was the right thing. Put that to one side. In the end, constitutionally, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have to have simultaneously a collective sense of endeavour based on objectives and a diagnosis they share, but to be really tough on each other, not to make mistakes. And if a government ends up neither having a clear rationale for where it's trying to go, or being in a situation where ex ante, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are stopping each other making mistakes, and don't find out they've made mistakes until after they've made mistakes, you end up with mistakes, and that's bad. So in the end, the objectives and the diagnosis and the institutional arrangements, but you also need to have, between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, challenge within a sense of shared collective endeavour. And if you can get all those three things right, I don't think any of them can simply be solved by machinery of government, but the machinery of government can definitely help.
That's fascinating. I want to give Kelly and Ayesha an opportunity to comment on a little of that. In particular, your early point, Ed, about we've been through an unusual era of crises, and we've been through crises as a country continuously since the Second World War. It feels like you could have added a few extra devaluation crises in there too. And what strikes me as a reader of political memoirs is that the politicians who did solve them and also achieved great things, doing difficult things, like, for example, you inherited quite an NHS in quite a poor position, and Gordon Brown raised national insurance to fund it in 2002, is that there did seem to be a bigger appetite to take political cost to deal with a crisis and square with the voters during these times. Like Roy Jenkins's budget in 1969 is another example I give, where he did square with the public. Now, I'm interested to hear first from Kelly and then Ayesha. Is there a sense that the voters appreciate that you need to take political costs if you're to achieve great things or deal with crises? Or has that particular pain point changed over the years?
So we're doing some work actually with my colleague, lovely colleague in the audience, who's done a lot of this work with Andy Haldane at the minute, which he'll publish on shortly. And also I'll not say too much, but a little bit. It's obvious to us from the data that the public are currently much more open to new ideas, to new thinking, to new ways of solving old problems than they have been for some time. And in some ways, that might give a sense of hope and optimism to those who are seeking to find new ways to solve some of those old problems. The challenge we have is that they both believe the system and those operating the system are not capable of driving those new solutions. And so there's a credibility piece there that needs to be overcome. But the points that have been raised by both Ed and Ayesha about the state we're in today is very different from the state we're in. The context is very different. Trust in civil servants, we saw it on an upward trajectory for some time, since 1983. From 2019, that's been on a downward trajectory again, and partly linked to some of the pandemic issues. We have challenges linked to ways of working in the country as well. Many of the professional occupations are now operating in a remote or a hybrid way. That does make it harder to drive forward change at pace and also with a collective sense of purpose. It just does. And that is both general professional services, but also civil service. The loss of confidence in the state and democracy, not just in this country, but many countries, is under pressure. We have currently, in our polling in January, where we asked people to look at the year ahead and what they think is going to happen this year, almost 3/4 of them think we're going to be facing into some very significant political and civil unrest, and that will be linked to the way in which our system is operating for people. So it is an unprecedented time, but they're open to new ideas. They just have an issue around the credibility of those operating the system today.
Interesting. And Ayesha, I mean, we have, for example, we had to spend £400 billion dealing with a pandemic, and voters must understand at some level that needs to be paid back. And we now have this incredibly worrying security situation that necessitates defence spending. In your view, are voters being told about the costs we need to face in future to address these problems?
No, absolutely not. And I think we are being dishonest with the public, and it's a stupid dishonesty, because the public are smart enough to work out that the money is going to have to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
For example, in the run-up to the election, I suppose this is the exam question. I'd kind of like to hear, Ed and Kelly's sort of thoughts on this as well. The public did not buy Labour's promise ahead of the election that we were not going to have to raise taxes, small brackets, for working people. They just didn't, right? They just didn't. Yet Labour strategists would say there was no way we were going to win that election because of history, and whereas most normal people just like, of course Labour was going to win that election, because like the Tories were sort of junk status by then. And the public are not stupid. They're not kind of, they're not expert academics, but they understand that things are difficult. And I think successive governments have sort of just been frightened of being honest with the public about the choices. You can't do everything. I mean, Louise said that earlier, talking about performative legislation and trying to be all things to all people. You cannot give everything that everybody wants. You just can't do it. You never could do it. You certainly can't do it now in our kind of very, very difficult economic climate. But what the politicians want, and I think this is why you are seeing the rise of the strongman kind of cliche, because I think the public have got sick of politicians sort of being too frightened to tell the truth to the public. And actually the public are clever, they're smart, they understand that things are difficult and to govern is to choose. So take, for example, as you rightly say, the big existential threat facing us right now is security. And I think that this is a moment, I think the government should have actually done it earlier. Personally, I think after the Munich Security Council last year, which was a very, very big signal of the direction of travel that things were going. We have to be honest with the public about the threats to security. And that is going to mean many big interventions, which don't just give prescription, but as Ed says, gives an emotional diagnosis that tells the story of why this is important. This threat to our national security, it's not something, 10, 15, 20 years down the track. It's here today. The first duty of a Prime Minister and his or her government is to protect its citizens. Now is the time to have that honest conversation with the public. There was a report in the Times a couple of days ago saying that since the Strategic Defence Review, there is now a bigger black hole in terms of the finances, up to the tune of potentially £28 billion, but that has not been sort of confirmed. The public know that we need to spend more in defence. The public know that our armed forces and our military is hollowed out. They know the money is going to have to come from somewhere. So maybe now is the honest time to sort of say to the public, look, this is the situation now. We are going to have to either trim some spending here, or we're going to have to raise some... I mean, some of my Times Radio listeners actually after the Munich Security Conference, and they're very, very savvy, they were like, we can see the way things are going. Is this time to raise taxes ring-fenced for defence? I mean, one of my listeners said you could call it a patriotic penny on the pound, in terms of defence. But also, so there are trade-offs, but there's also a good story to tell. I was speaking to a union leader who's not over the moon with everything that this government is doing, but saying there is a really good story to be told about defence. Yes, it's frightening, the world that we're in, but there's a revolution in terms of jobs, advanced manufacturing, really important skilled jobs that are happening all over the country, places like Barrow and Furness that were once left behind. There's incredible opportunities for young people with apprenticeships. But I think our politicians, going forward, the public wants a bit of courage and a bit of honesty. The public know that you can, and also I think the public are sick of being sold a pup all the time. They're told that they can have, everything, it's not going to cost anything. Even people voted for Brexit kind of look at what's happened now and the pennies drop that guess what, all of this stuff is not going so well. So I think a bit more honesty. And Louise's point is to decide is to divide. You're always going to have that. And sometimes you have to have a row. Sometimes you have to be prepared to say, this is my choice, this is what I believe in, this is the due diligence we've done. Show your workings to the public as well and be honest. So something like reform of the welfare, which was obviously a big setback for the government. The government didn't do their reform on welfare, and whether you agree with that or not, it's come at a great cost to the government. But there is, I think, clearly an appetite in the public, and there's an appetite across politics to do something humane and dignified, but sensible and strategic about the growing welfare state. But you have to make the right argument about it, because you can't do two things at once. You can't say that as the Labour Party we're going to do a humane welfare to work scheme, which is going to get loads of people back into work, and you're going to save loads of money at the same time. You can't do it. All the experts know it. The public know as well. But you have to set out an argument about what you want to do, where you're going to get to. We all want to see young people and other people who can work get back to work. We know it's good for people. We want to get the bill down. But you have to be honest and say it's not going to save money immediately. In fact, you might have to invest money up front to then later on down the track get the savings. But it's about having honest conversations and showing you're working to the public.
So I'm as guilty as anyone, but when we talk about the public, they are not, and increasingly not, a homogeneous mass, which makes it incredibly difficult to engage with them on complex topics. So it's not a surprise that communication in government post-pandemic has become really, really difficult. And so getting the messages right to the groups, but also hearing from them on, for security. You're absolutely right. This is a top order. We know this. We know this is a top order issue. They're still very, very worried about cost of living as an upfront issue over and above security and defence. But how do you bring the public with you on a big topic like that? And how do you nuance the conversation? And some of the techniques, if I look at, so we're about 2,000 people at Ipsos. We have everything from ethnography and social research to neuro research to passively measuring what people do online. It's quite holistic. The techniques that we've used in the past, the sort of traditional research methods in dealing with the complexity that we face today on their own are not enough. Focus groups, polling, and I know I've used a lot of polling data today, but things like citizens' assemblies, dialogues, but at speed, with the quality of evidence within them, can really help you to understand how to bring the public with you, because you do need them with you to make change happen. It's not just central government, local government. The public have to act too within this sphere. So but one example was the well-known Ken Livingstone example, the congestion charge, where he did not have the public with him in London, but he did it anyway, and he demonstrated through improving public services and sheer personal willpower that you can eventually get the public on side with difficult decisions. And I think that one's from 2003, so it's quite a while ago. And I bet there are better example that are more recent.
Well, you could argue Sadiq Khan's push on clean air was very sort of unpopular, but it is actually, yielding results. And just one thing to pick up on that quickly, I think, communication is very important on this, and it's a very, aggressive, difficult, communications world at the moment. But one bit of advice that I would have for the centre is change the grid system in terms of how we do our communications, because it is so hard to tell a story just when and Ed and I do this a lot on Good Morning Britain. You have some poor junior minister sent out, or even a cabinet minister, to talk about something that has fought its way to be on the grid. It's not that it's not important, but it's not that relevant to like the big kind of issues of the day, and that poor person is subjected to a very forensic, inquisitive interview from Ed Balls, and they want to talk about their one tiny issue on dentistry or something like that, which is in and of itself really important. But I just think if the government wants to do a better job in a very hostile climate of telling the story, tying yourself to the brutality of this grid with a very hostile media climate is, I think it's not working.
It's disastrous.
Yeah. I ought to apologise that we normally try to provide sort of 20 or 30 minutes for audience questions, but I hope you appreciate the answers up from the panel up here. It's been too interesting to allow that to be the case. Can I ask for 3 questions from within the room? And I think we might just about have time for them if everyone is haiku-like in their responses. We have 2 over here. Is that might be it? Oh, and a 3rd. Excellent.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
Yes, Andrew Haldenby, Effective Governance Forum. Look, I'm just going to say this. Ed, your performance of Gangnam Style on Strictly was a massive positive moment for my young family those years ago. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Repeat?
It was the week Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. And my daughter said to me, what is going on in America? And I said, I'm really sorry, I've got to put my leisure wear on and go and do a salsa. But, it was very important for binding the nation.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was the act of resistance we
started to heal.
Oh, the question is, how can government be strategic, as Ed wants, in this era of new media where politicians are required to respond to everything within not just seconds, microseconds?
Excellent question. Thank you.
Patrick Stevens, I'm really following on from almost exactly the same point, but with a slightly different angle, which is, Ed, I completely agree that you need a clear rationale and objectives and diagnosis, but I do challenge the concept that it hasn't got harder to be able to communicate that. I think for the reasons that have been said, we've admitted that it's a unique set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. The current culture of gotcha interviews and, quite frankly, a misinformation agenda from abroad does make it much more difficult. And I wonder, where do you think the line is for the media in trying to moderate that and allows for a more sensible discussion rather than constant sound bites?
And over here, please.
Thank you, Grace Duffy from Bridges Outcomes Partnerships. I want to ask a question which is a bit technocratic as a former civil servant, I suppose. That's what I will tend to do, but about complexity. So I'd say in my more than a decade in government, I'd say the worst decisions that I saw were not just those which kind of focus on the short term rather than the long term, which is something we've picked up on, but also those which were really siloed instead of understanding and addressing complexity. And for me, that really seems like that's what the centre of government should be for, to really understand that complexity and grip it and sort of drive decisions which reflect that. But also, from my perspective, very importantly, budgets which actually understand and reflect that complexity and are driving towards more joined-up solutions. So I just wonder, and I think this is not the first time I've asked this at the IFG, probably, but like, what is genuinely stopping that? And surely, as we've kind of discussed, I really agree with Kelly and Ayesha, but the public can and are willing to tackle and understand that complexity. So what is it practically, what is it politically that is actually stopping that, which it seems that everybody agrees is necessary?
Fantastic. Can I ask for that last question to be answered first, because it's such a wonderfully Institute for Government question, how we can get across the departmental boundary. Can I start with Ayesha and Ed on that question, and then ask Kelly about how to get some strategic thinking in this maelstrom of social media? So Ayesha first.
I think it's more simple and straightforward than we're led to believe, and I just hark back to my time working on the Equality Bill and things like that. It is about getting people together in a room on a regular basis and not just doing the torturous right round to procrastinate, but actually getting heads together, trying to sort these problems out together and actually having that kind of dialogue. And I think but there's got to be the political will to make that happen. You can't just outsource that to your civil servants do. I think that takes, yes, willing from the civil servants, but also I think it takes political direction from the ministers as well.
Ed, getting departments to work together and break down silos, how did it work in your time?
Well, so I didn't say it hadn't got harder. I just said that I don't think that saying the politicians are not as good as they used to be, or the civil servants are not as good as they used to be is right. And I think having 4 once-in-a-generation crises in short succession and an underlying squeeze on productivity, which is so driving a public sentiment, is very hard. So I'll come back to the media question in a moment. But I think really the first question, the third one, about being strategic and cross-government working, they come down to the same thing, which is that, first of all, I just think you have to have a diagnosis which you then go out and try and win the argument for. Now, I could tell you what I think the underlying challenge for the British economy is. I think the 4 things. I don't think I agree with everything the government is doing, but I don't know what the government's big argument is. I don't know why does the Treasury think our economy has had such low productivity growth for the last 15 years? And I think they talk a lot about stability, and stability is like it is a precondition, but that is not the answer. And I think there is stuff around the markets we trade in, the institutional capacity of key components of our regional economies, and the underlying dynamism of our economy, which is the most important thing. This has been a stultifyingly stagnant economy for 20 years. We don't have the kind of dynamism which we used to have. The outlier in the last 5 years compared to Britain and Europe has been America, because they've embraced, almost by accident because of the pandemic, a dynamism, a churn in their labour market, which has been actually hugely productivity enhancing and hugely wage enhancing for lower wage workers. We haven't had that. So I would like them to go after dynamism. But if they think that's wrong, which they may do, I want to know what is the other argument. And you should locate your decisions in the spending review and in the budget and how you answer questions in that big argument. And I feel as though they may think that's too intellectual, but I actually think winning the intellectual argument is so important. And I don't know if I fully understand securonomics, but I worry it may be an anti-dynamism argument.
Yeah.
And if that's true, I think that's the wrong reading. So that is my answer to the first question. And then in terms of if you have an underlying argument, and then you set your goals, which are about what we're going to do to turn that round, and you have an institutional capacity at the centre to really drive analysis and delivery, including saying regularly which levers aren't we pulling. Out from that comes the places where you need to pull and collaborate. And I said earlier, I think on the international side, there are good institutional mechanisms for collaboration between Foreign Affairs and MOD and No.10, and there'll be some pooling going on there. I think actually on the European side, it's gone better than I might have expected. I just don't see that happening in the same way on the domestic side. And there's lots of things that you can do. When I was Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families, I had dual key responsibility with other cabinet ministers where we both had to sign off each other's spending in order to move forward in areas which were clearly cross-departmental. I think that's gone. Or you can have units with budgets at the centre. I think that's harder. But you need to do something. And if you have a stock take where the Treasury is not there, and the Prime Minister says to Secretary of State for X, why aren't you doing anything about this? And they say, well, it's not really up to me because it's the other department. And you say, well, okay, and that's an action point. I just don't think that's enough. So I think the institutional mechanisms to drive solutions to that is the thing which is why I go back to delivery. Should I say one other thing about media? And then I've done all my answers. Just really quickly. On the media side, I actually think this is, what Ayesha says is so important. And this comes from, I don't know when it happened, but I think it's really Boris Johnson and the pandemic. This idea that you have the media round where you send out one person on every broadcast outlet with a story, which is often unrelated to the story of the day. And it is so draining for the credibility of government to have a junior health minister on a day when the big story is Greenland saying either I don't know or I'll give you the line to take, but I can't answer you any other questions. Good governments put out the person on the day who's best equipped to answer the questions of the day. And actually, it's okay sometimes to have the Foreign Secretary and the Education Secretary out, because there's two big things going on. And for some reason, that's gone. And therefore, we treat the public as though they don't deserve the respect of a good answer with genuine depth. And I think that is like a retrograde step, and it goes back. I think it probably goes back to control, but it is a mistake. And I think, and this is my final point. So I sit there in a chair every morning. This morning, we interviewed Ed Davey and Alex Norris on immigration. Actually, with Alex Norris, we talked to him about his story. What you want is people who can answer the big question of the day. I am not a shock jock interviewer because I really believe politics is really important, and I really want the government to do well, and the opposition to do well actually, and I want the public to think I understand better why it's hard and what they're doing at the end of our interview. And therefore, I would always start off wanting them to answer the question and to explain it. But when you then get blocked by somebody who won't even engage with the question, sticks to the lines to take, doesn't know what they're talking about because it's not their policy area, and you end up thinking, we haven't progressed. And that happens much too much. And so you're totally right. And that is a communication challenge. So it's dead easy for politicians to sit around and say, there's social media age, and it's all a nightmare, and, it's all polarised. But actually, it's also down to political communication itself to rise to the challenge. And it feels as though, it's not ambitious enough. And I think the public feel let down by it.
Thank you very much. Kelly.
I'll be super fast. So we do the measurement for what people read in the newspapers, what they listen to on the radio, but also what they do online, which is fascinating when they forget that you're monitoring them, all GDPR compliant. But media, you're absolutely right, harder to communicate, more fragmented as a media space, and it is transforming as an industry. It is going through a huge amount of tech AI transformation, and you can see how people consume media has transformed, largely online, even though those online sources are not massively trusted by the general public, but they still do consume most of their media that way. Even young people, not very trusting of it, but they do consume their media in that way. So the government does need to be mindful of those shifts, not just the medium, the messages that are going out obviously need a coherent message and different channels for different audiences. What I would say is tech and AI and the transformation of that industry are a challenge for government, but it is also a fabulous opportunity if they can themselves harness tech and AI as part of the solution. And I'm not sure it's fully abreast of that yet, rather than a grid, a static system, which, as you say, doesn't necessarily help the government to manage their communication on information flows, but also communicating on performance. So there's a lot, I think, can be used from the transformation of the industry to help improve how government do effective communication themselves.
I agree with that.
Fantastic. I found that absolutely fascinating. So can you all join me in applauding our panel for what has been a really interesting... And we're only slightly over, but there's refreshments, and I think we're back here in 15 minutes or so. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.